New Yorkers, they're rude, they're crude, they don't give you any time, no one's friendly when you walk down the street. I don't get that.
No,
I don't
it's
get
not
that at
true.
all. I actually love the
huge
people.
misconception,
It's a huge misconception. When we walk down the street, I love how friendly people are.
Drew Scott, the charismatic half of the Property Brothers duo, has spent over a decade transforming homes and hearts on screen. With his infectious energy, camera-ready smile, and seemingly perfect life, fans believed they knew everything about him. The charming real estate expert alongside his twin brother Jonathan seemed untouchable, an unstoppable force in the world of renovation television. But behind the walls of renovated homes and the glow of HGTV success lies a far more somber story. One that fans rarely hear, one that Drew Scott himself kept hidden for years. Because what the cameras never showed were the moments Drew nearly gave up. The private grief he endured while smiling through scenes, the devastating battles with self-worth, identity, and the crushing pressure of being the strong twin when everything inside was falling apart. Fame may have brought him wealth and recognition, but it also magnified his isolation. And while millions watched him build dream homes for others, Drew was quietly struggling to hold his own emotional foundation together. There were health scares, silent miscarriages, career betrayals, and a personal loss so deep it shattered his outlook on life. Today, at 47, Drew is finally allowing the truth to be told, not for sympathy, but for understanding. Because behind every confident contractor is a human being fighting battles we'll never see on television. This is the untold, heartbreaking tragedy of Drew Scott, a story that may change the way you see the Property Brothers forever. Drew Scott was born just 4 minutes before his identical twin brother, Jonathan. But from the very beginning, he was cast in a different light. While Jonathan gravitated toward flashy showmanship, magic tricks, costumes, and a flair for performance, Drew was quieter, more internal, more careful. Even as they built a multi-million-dollar empire on HGTV, fans often saw Drew as the organized one, the businessman, the calm, collected anchor to Jonathan's larger-than-life personality. But what the audience didn't see, what Drew rarely let anyone see, was that the role he played came with a heavy emotional cost. For most of his life, Drew felt pressure not just to succeed, but to hold it all together. He was the fixer, the peacekeeper, the brother who kept his emotions buried so others could thrive. And when fame came, that emotional suppression only got worse. While millions tuned in to watch the Property Brothers renovate homes, Drew was quietly unraveling behind the scenes. Fame brought attention, but also pressure. Pressure to smile, to be perfect, to be the ideal husband, brother, and business partner. And when things began to fall apart in his personal life, he told no one. Few know that before he married his wife, Linda Fan, the couple endured not just one, but multiple silent miscarriages. They never made headlines. There were no tabloid covers or Instagram confessionals, just private grief, endured in silence, while Drew continued filming, working, and performing. In interviews, he remained upbeat, but those close to him say there were moments when Drew would disappear after shoots, physically and emotionally. He'd sit alone for hours, avoiding calls, avoiding people. He didn't want to burden others, least of all his brother. Jonathan was always the louder twin, one crew member recalled. But Drew was the one people worried about in quiet moments. You could see something behind his eyes. That quiet suffering extended beyond family loss. Early in their career, Drew was blindsided by a betrayal that nearly ended his dream. A close friend and business associate, someone he had trusted with personal finances, mismanaged their early earnings and left Drew on the verge of financial collapse. It happened before the brothers signed their first major television deal, when they were still scraping together renovation jobs and barely making rent. Drew didn't even tell Jonathan the full story for months. He took the blame, quietly worked to fix it, and kept moving. That would become a pattern in his life, taking on pain so others wouldn't have to. Even after their show became a sensation, Drew still felt like he was living in someone else's story. Jonathan, with his playful charisma, naturally drew more attention from fans and media alike, and while the bond between them remained strong, Drew sometimes felt invisible, even in the spotlight. Behind his polished smile and meticulous demeanor was a man struggling with identity. Who was he, beyond the camera angles and open-concept kitchens? What part of him was real, and what part had become performance? Those questions haunted him late at night, when the cameras stopped rolling and the house was quiet. And still he said nothing. Not to the public, not even to those closest to him. Because Drew Scott wasn't just building homes, he was building walls around himself. Strong, quiet walls meant to protect him from the grief, fear, and emotional exhaustion he carried for years. But even the strongest walls eventually crack. When Drew Scott married Linda Fan in 2018, it was celebrated as the fairy tale fans had long been waiting for. The two had been together for nearly a decade, partners in business, life, and quiet resilience. Their wedding in Italy was beautiful, extravagant, and captured in a special aired on HGTV. The world saw romance, perfection, the kind of love story that seemed to mirror the dream homes Drew helped create on television. But the truth behind the curtain was far more complex and heartbreaking. Because while the world saw smiles, Drew and Linda were facing something few could imagine: the slow, silent grief of infertility and loss. Shortly after their wedding, the couple began trying for a child, and when nothing happened, they went through the long, painful process of testing, treatment, and waiting. Drew, who had always dreamed of being a father, quietly carried the weight of each disappointment. Every negative test, every failed round of treatment, and worst of all, the miscarriages they endured in secret. No headlines, no press releases, just heartbreak in private, followed by makeup calls, production schedules, and filming days where he had to smile while his world felt like it was collapsing. The emotional toll was immense. Friends close to the couple said Drew withdrew during those years. He became quieter, more introspective, often avoiding social gatherings. Even when he was surrounded by success, a deep sadness lingered behind his eyes. Linda, ever supportive, stood by him, but she too was in pain. And both chose silence, not because they didn't want to share, but because the world had already placed them on a pedestal. The perfect couple, the ideal home. And when you're known for building dreams, it's hard to admit when your own dream is falling apart. It wasn't just personal, it was emotional warfare. Every episode filmed with a family welcoming a newborn or renovating a nursery became another reminder of what they were missing. And Drew, who prided himself on being composed and professional, often broke down between takes. One former producer revealed that during a holiday special, Drew disappeared for nearly an hour after filming a segment with a family of 5. He came back smiling, but his eyes were red, they said. That was the first time we realized he wasn't okay. If this story is touching you the way it's touched us, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful, emotional stories behind the faces we think we know. And if you've ever carried silent grief like Drew, drop a comment. You're not alone, and neither is he. Back to the story. Despite the pain, Drew never stopped showing up. For Linda, for his fans, for the crew. But something inside him shifted. He began quietly stepping back from certain projects, deferring more leadership to Jonathan, and focusing instead on healing. He started therapy, something he once admitted he never thought he'd need. He began speaking to other couples in similar situations, not as a celebrity but as a grieving husband. And though he rarely spoke publicly about the miscarriages, those close to him say that period changed him. It softened him. It deepened his understanding of emotional resilience. And it made him realize that sometimes, even the strongest builders have to tear things down before they can rebuild. In recent years, Drew and Linda welcomed their first child after years of struggle. But the joy of that moment was carved from years of quiet suffering. The world celebrated with them, but only a few understood the full story. Because for Drew Scott, the most beautiful home he ever built wasn't for TV. It was the one he and Linda created from pain, healing, and hope, together, behind closed doors. At the height of Property Brothers fame, Drew Scott's face was everywhere. Magazines, billboards, syndication deals, international tours. The show wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural phenomenon. Fans tuned in religiously, expecting flawless renovations and the warm, comforting chemistry between Drew and Jonathan. They were America's favorite twins, building homes and selling dreams with effortless charm. But the truth behind that polished exterior was darker, lonelier, and filled with an invisible weight Drew carried alone. Because while the world adored the image of the put-together brother, Drew was silently buckling under the expectations. Every smile was rehearsed. Every line was delivered with practiced warmth. And every second of silence off camera became a battleground for anxiety, burnout, and emotional isolation. What many don't know is that Drew suffered from crippling imposter syndrome. Even after years of success, he constantly questioned whether he was truly worthy of the empire they'd built. Was he just the guy who stood next to Jonathan while others did the heavy lifting? Did he deserve the admiration he was getting from fans across the world? Those internal doubts, combined with the brutal pace of production, sometimes filming 60 to 70 hours a week, led to a complete breakdown. According to a former showrunner, there was a moment during a season finale where Drew had to step away in the middle of a take. He just stared at the floor, they said. Didn't move. Didn't speak. It was like something in him just shut down. That moment was never aired. Production paused. He returned after a brief break, smiling like nothing happened. But behind the scenes, it was clear. Drew Scott was not okay. What made it harder was his role within the dynamic of the show. Jonathan was the builder, the one who could be messy and improvisational. Drew was the suit, the planner, the guy who always knew what came next. But that structure came at a price. Drew rarely had space to feel. His role demanded certainty, leadership, a clean face for the camera, regardless of what was falling apart inside. And fall apart it did. There were days when he barely ate, nights when he couldn't sleep, mornings where he begged himself in the mirror to just make it through the day. And all the while, social media kept praising him. Drew's the strong one, fans would write. So calm, so in control. But those words only deepened his loneliness, because strength without vulnerability is a cage, and Drew had been locked in it for years. Even his relationship with Jonathan, once bulletproof, began to strain. Not because of jealousy or conflict, but because Drew didn't know how to tell his brother he was struggling. He didn't want to disappoint him. He didn't want to shatter the image the world loved so much. But Jonathan knew. He saw the late-night texts, the distant stares, the growing silence. And in one quiet moment on the road, he reportedly sat Drew down and said, "You don't have to hold the whole world together, man. Let someone hold you." That moment, friends say, marked the beginning of Drew's healing. Therapy followed. Mindfulness. A new approach to life that no longer chased perfection but embraced truth. He began speaking to others behind the scenes, crew members, friends, even fans, about the importance of mental health. And slowly, Drew stopped performing and started being, not just the fixer, not just the face, but a man finally learning how to rebuild from the inside out. In the world Drew Scott created, where every broken wall could be patched, every space transformed, and every story wrapped in a satisfying reveal, there was still one place he couldn't fix: himself. For years, he poured his energy into other people's dreams, designing the perfect home for families who had lived through loss, illness, and tragedy. He was their safe place, the smiling expert who promised that no matter how bad it had been, better days were ahead. But as the cameras turned off and the crews packed up, Drew often returned to a home that felt emotionally vacant. Not because it lacked beauty, but because it had become a place where he hid his pain rather than healed from it. The irony was cruel. The man who rebuilt lives for a living didn't know how to rebuild his own, even after the arrival of his child, a moment of joy that followed years of heartbreak. Drew found himself unable to fully shake the emotional numbness that had taken root. He loved deeply. He showed up, but the grief he had buried, the years of silence and emotional suppression, had left scars that no amount of success could erase. It wasn't until Linda sat him down one evening, holding his hand, tearfully asking if he was truly happy, that something cracked open. He didn't answer at first. He couldn't. But in that silence, he realized the question wasn't whether he was happy. It was whether he had ever allowed himself to truly feel anything beyond obligation. For decades, Drew had been performing strength, and now he was finally starting to grieve what he'd lost while doing so. That moment marked a shift. Slowly, he stepped away from the relentless pace of fame. He delegated more. He spent longer stretches off camera, choosing family over fanfare. And most importantly, he gave himself permission to not be okay. He talked about therapy, about burnout, about loss. Not in a viral headline or PR campaign, but in quiet conversations, at charity events, during podcast interviews, in late-night texts with fans who had shared their own stories of miscarriage, depression, or hopelessness. He began using his platform for something deeper than design. He used it to build emotional honesty. And the response was overwhelming. People saw him not just as a TV host or a celebrity, but as a human being who had silently carried the same invisible weight they did. For the first time in his public life, Drew Scott was no longer performing. He was living, authentically, imperfectly, and still somehow, beautifully. The tragedy of Drew Scott isn't that he fell, it's that he spent so many years pretending he hadn't. And yet, in the ruins of that denial, he found something far more valuable than applause. He found peace. Today, as he nears 50, Drew isn't trying to be the strongest man in the room. He's just trying to be real. A father, a husband. A man who still designs homes, but now knows that the foundation of any life worth living starts within. He'll never stop building. It's who he is. But now, when he walks into a broken space, whether it's physical or emotional, he no longer believes it's his job to fix it alone. And that may be the most powerful renovation of all.